In the annals of sporting history, few stories have captured the world's imagination quite like that of Oscar Leonard Karl Pistorius. Born on November 22, 1986, in Sandton, South Africa, he entered the world missing both fibular bones in his lower legs, a condition that would have condemned most to a life of limitation. Instead, it became the foundation of a legend that would inspire millions before crashing down in the most tragic of circumstances. When Oscar was just 11 months old, his parents made the agonizing decision to have both his legs amputated below the knee. It was a choice born of love and hope, a chance to give their son mobility and independence through prosthetic limbs rather than leaving him bound to a wheelchair for life. Little did they know they were creating not just a person who could walk, but someone who would run faster than most people ever dreamed possible. The boy who would become known as the Blade Runner grew up in a middle-class family in Pretoria, where his mother Sheila instilled in him a fierce determination never to see his disability as a limitation. "Put on your legs and get out there," she would tell him, words that would echo throughout his extraordinary career. His father Henke provided the practical support and encouragement that allowed Oscar to explore every avenue of athleticism, from water polo to tennis, before finding his true calling on the running track. By the time Oscar reached his teenage years, he was already displaying the competitive fire that would drive him to the heights of international sport. A rugby injury in 2003 led him to the track as part of his rehabilitation, and it was there that his destiny truly began to unfold. Running on his carbon fiber prosthetic legs, the revolutionary cheetah blades that would become his trademark, Oscar discovered he possessed not just speed, but a will to win that bordered on the supernatural. Oscar's rise through the ranks of Paralympic sport was meteoric. At the 2004 Paralympic Games in Athens, just 1 year after taking up serious running, he won gold in the 200 meters and bronze in the 100 meters. But even these achievements paled in comparison to what was to come. The young South African wasn't content to dominate Paralympic competition, he had his sights set on something that many considered impossible, competing against able-bodied athletes at the highest levels of international sport. The journey to realize this dream was fraught with controversy and legal battles. The International Association of Athletics Federations, IAAF, initially banned Oscar from competing in their events, arguing that his carbon fiber blades gave him an unfair advantage over runners using biological legs. The scientific community was divided, with some studies suggesting the blades provided a mechanical advantage in energy return, while others argued that the disadvantages, particularly in starting blocks and navigating curves, more than compensated for any benefits. Oscar refused to accept the ban, launching a legal challenge that would take him all the way to the Court of Arbitration for Sport. His determination was absolute, his confidence unshakable. "I am not disabled," he would declare to anyone who would listen. "I have an ability, and I want to use it to compete at the highest level." The court ruled in his favor in 2008, opening the door for Oscar to pursue his Olympic dreams. The decision sent shockwaves through the sporting world and transformed Oscar from a Paralympic champion into a global icon representing the triumph of human spirit over physical limitation. At the 2008 Beijing Olympics, Oscar failed to qualify for the individual 400-meter final but ran in the heats, becoming the first amputee sprinter to compete at an Olympic Games. The image of him lining up against the world's fastest able-bodied runners, his distinctive blade-like prosthetics gleaming under the stadium lights, became one of the defining moments of those games. But it was at the 2012 London Olympics that Oscar truly achieved immortality. Not only did he compete in the individual 400 meters, but he was also selected for South Africa's 4x400-meter relay team. When he crossed the finish line in that relay final, having run the anchor leg for his country, the stadium erupted in a celebration that transcended sport itself. Here was a man who had redefined what was possible, who had forced the world to reconsider its assumptions about disability and human potential. Success brought Oscar everything he had dreamed of and more. Endorsement deals with major corporations made him wealthy beyond his wildest childhood fantasies. Nike, Oakley, and BT were among the brands that wanted to associate themselves with his inspirational story. His face appeared on magazine covers around the world, and he became a sought-after motivational speaker whose words could command fees of hundreds of thousands of dollars. The boy from Pretoria had become a global celebrity, traveling the world to compete, speak at corporate events, and make appearances that further burnished his image as a symbol of hope and determination. He lived in a luxurious gated community in Pretoria called Silver Woods Country Estate, where his home was filled with the trophies and medals that marked his journey from disabled child to international icon. But beneath the glittering surface of success, those close to Oscar began to notice troubling signs. The pressure of constant scrutiny, the demands of competition at the highest level, and the weight of representing disabled people around the world had begun to take their toll. Oscar, who had always been intensely competitive and perfectionist in his approach to training, became increasingly volatile in his personal relationships. Friends and family members later recalled incidents that suggested Oscar was struggling with anger management issues. He could be charming and charismatic in public, but in private, he sometimes displayed a temper that could flare without warning. The same competitive drive that had made him a champion seemed to manifest in other areas of his life as an inability to accept defeat or criticism. There were also growing concerns about Oscar's relationship with firearms. South Africa's high crime rate meant that many wealthy residents owned guns for protection, but Oscar's interest in weapons seemed to go beyond mere security concerns. He owned multiple firearms and was known to carry a pistol with him regularly, even sleeping with a gun under his bed, a habit that would prove fatally relevant on that terrible Valentine's Day in 2013. Riva Rebecca Steenkamp was everything that South Africa's celebrity culture celebrated. Born on August 19, 1983, in Cape Town, she had grown up to become one of the country's most recognizable faces, a model, television personality, and law graduate who seemed to embody intelligence, beauty, and ambition in equal measure. Riva's path to fame had been unconventional but determined. After completing her law degree at the University of Port Elizabeth, she had briefly worked as a paralegal before deciding to pursue modeling and television work. Her striking blonde hair, warm smile, and natural charisma quickly made her a favorite for magazine covers and advertising campaigns. But Riva was more than just a pretty face. Those who knew her well described a woman of substance, someone who was passionate about women's rights and who used her platform to speak out against domestic violence, an irony that would become heartbreakingly apparent in the aftermath of her death. She was intelligent, articulate, and ambitious, with dreams that extended far beyond the superficial world of celebrity culture. When Oscar and Riva met at a mutual friend's party in November 2012, the attraction was immediate and intense. Here were two of South Africa's biggest celebrities, both young, successful, and beautiful in their own ways. The media immediately dubbed them the country's golden couple, and their relationship became the subject of constant public fascination. Their romance played out in the glare of the South African tabloid press, with photographers capturing their appearances at movie premieres, restaurant dinners, and sporting events. They seemed perfectly matched, the inspirational athlete and the glamorous model, both at the peaks of their respective careers. But those close to the couple began to notice signs that all was not well in paradise. Friends later recalled that Oscar could be possessive and jealous, uncomfortable with the attention that other men paid to his beautiful girlfriend. Riva, independent and strong-willed, sometimes chafed at what she perceived as attempts to control her social interactions and career choices. Text messages that would later be revealed during the trial painted a picture of a relationship marked by increasing tension. Riva had complained to friends about Oscar's jealousy and his volatile temper. There were arguments about her friendships with other men, disagreements about her career commitments, and growing concern among her circle about the dynamic between the two celebrities. February 14, 2013, began like any other day in the Pistorius household. Oscar had been training hard for the upcoming athletic season, maintaining the rigorous schedule that had made him a world champion. Riva had been busy with her own career commitments, including the filming of a reality television show that would air posthumously, giving her final appearances on screen a haunting quality that viewers would never forget. The couple had planned a quiet evening together at Oscar's home in the exclusive Silver Woods estate. It was meant to be a romantic Valentine's Day celebration, a chance for two busy celebrities to enjoy each other's company away from the constant scrutiny of the public eye. Oscar's house was a testament to his success, a sprawling modern home with every luxury imaginable, from a swimming pool to a home theater. But it was also a fortress, equipped with multiple security systems, high walls, and armed response contracts that reflected the harsh realities of life for the wealthy in contemporary South Africa. The country's crime statistics were sobering. Home invasions, armed robberies, and violent crimes were daily realities for many South Africans, particularly those whose wealth made them attractive targets. Oscar, like many of his contemporaries, lived in a state of constant vigilance, always aware that his celebrity status and obvious prosperity could make him a target. That evening, Oscar and Riva had dinner together before settling in to watch television. They appeared relaxed and happy, according to Oscar's later testimony, a couple enjoying the simple pleasure of each other's company on the most romantic day of the year. There was no indication, he would later claim, of any argument or tension between them. As the evening progressed into night, the couple retired to Oscar's bedroom. It was here, in the pre-dawn hours of February 14, that the events occurred that would destroy both their lives and captivate the world's attention for years to come. According to Oscar's account, he was awakened in the early hours of the morning by a sound that sent ice through his veins, what he believed was the noise of an intruder breaking into his home. In a country where home invasions often ended in torture and murder, Oscar's reaction was swift and, he claimed, instinctive. Without stopping to put on his prosthetic legs, Oscar grabbed the 9mm pistol he kept beside his bed and began moving toward what he believed was the source of the disturbance. In his testimony, he described a terror so absolute that rational thought seemed impossible. Here was a man who had faced down the world's fastest sprinters, who had overcome physical challenges that would have broken lesser spirits, reduced to primal fear by the possibility of violent crime in his own home. The layout of Oscar's house would become crucial to understanding the events that followed. His bedroom was connected to a bathroom, which in turn led to a separate toilet cubicle with a small window. It was from this toilet that Oscar claimed to have heard the sounds that convinced him an intruder was in his home. Moving on his stumps, feeling vulnerable and exposed without his prosthetic legs, Oscar approached the bathroom door. The house was dark, and he claimed he had deliberately avoided turning on lights to avoid alerting the supposed intruder to his presence. In his mind, he was defending not just his own life but that of Riva, whom he believed was still safely asleep in his bed. What happened next would be debated in courtrooms, analyzed by forensic experts, and discussed by the global media for years to come. Oscar fired 4 shots through the locked door of the toilet cubicle, using hollow-point ammunition designed for maximum stopping power. The sound of the gunshots in the confined space would have been deafening, a thunderclap of violence that shattered the peaceful night. But it was what Oscar discovered next that transformed this story from a case of mistaken identity home defense into one of the most sensational criminal trials of the 21st century. When he finally broke down the door to the toilet cubicle, he found not an intruder, but Riva, beautiful, vibrant Riva, dying from the gunshot wounds he had inflicted. The emergency services call that Oscar made at 3:19 a.m., just minutes after the shooting, would later be analyzed word by forensic experts and legal teams. His voice, caught in that moment between disbelief and horror, painted a picture of a man whose world had just collapsed around him. "There's been a terrible accident," he told the operator, his voice breaking with emotion. "I shot my girlfriend. I thought she was an intruder. Please send help." The first responders who arrived at the scene found a tableau that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Oscar was holding Riva's bloodied body, her head cradled in his lap, alternately praying and pleading with her to stay alive. The bathroom floor was awash with blood, and the door to the toilet cubicle had been smashed apart with a cricket bat, evidence of Oscar's desperate attempt to reach Riva after realizing his terrible mistake. Paramedic Warren Behrens, one of the first medical professionals on scene, later testified that Riva had already succumbed to her injuries by the time they arrived. The hollow-point bullets had caused devastating damage, and there had never been any realistic hope of saving her life once those shots were fired. The police officers who responded found Oscar in a state that seemed to oscillate between grief and shock. He appeared genuinely distraught, sobbing uncontrollably and repeatedly asking why this had happened. Yet even in those first chaotic moments, some of the responding officers noted details that would later become significant during the trial. Detective Warrant Officer Hilton Botha observed that Oscar's version of events, that he had moved to the bathroom on his stumps after hearing noises, was inconsistent with some of the physical evidence. The trajectory of the bullet holes, the positioning of Riva's body, and other forensic details raised questions about whether the shooting had occurred exactly as Oscar described. As news of the shooting spread, South Africa and the world struggled to comprehend what had happened. Oscar Pistorius, the man who had overcome impossible odds to become a symbol of human triumph, was suddenly at the center of a potential murder case. The transformation from hero to possible villain was so complete, so shocking, that many people simply refused to believe it could be true. The South African Police Service, led by Lieutenant Colonel Katlego Mogali, began what would become one of the most high-profile criminal investigations in the country's history. Every detail of the crime scene was meticulously documented, every piece of potential evidence was collected and analyzed, and Oscar's account of the events was subjected to intense scrutiny. The ballistics evidence would prove to be crucial to the case. Forensic expert Captain Christian Mangina determined that the 4 shots had been fired in rapid succession, with Riva likely falling after the first shot and sustaining the subsequent wounds while on the ground. The angle and trajectory of the bullets suggested that the shooter had been standing in a specific position relative to the toilet door, raising questions about whether the shots could have been fired accidentally or in a panic. Perhaps most significantly, the investigation revealed that Riva's bladder was empty when she died, suggesting she had indeed gotten up to use the toilet, exactly as Oscar claimed. However, this evidence was double-edged, as it also meant that she would have been making noise that could have alerted Oscar to her presence, undermining his claim that he believed she was still in bed. The forensic examination of Oscar's bedroom also revealed details that didn't align perfectly with his account. The position of fans in the room, the state of the bed, and other physical evidence suggested a sequence of events that may have been more complex than Oscar's straightforward narrative of waking up to investigate suspicious noises. From the moment news of Riva's death broke, the story became a global sensation. Here was a tale that combined celebrity, sport, romance, and tragedy in a mixture that proved irresistible to media outlets around the world. Oscar's transformation from inspirational hero to accused murderer was the kind of narrative that guaranteed massive audiences and endless speculation. The South African media, in particular, covered every development in the case with breathless intensity. Oscar's bail hearing was broadcast live on television, drawing millions of viewers who watched in fascination as the legal system grappled with the question of whether this national hero should be released pending trial. The international press was equally captivated. News crews from around the world descended on Pretoria, transforming the usually quiet courthouse into a carnival of satellite trucks, cameras, and reporters. Oscar's story had always been inspirational, but now it had become something far more complex, a real-life drama that blurred the lines between triumph and tragedy, hero and villain. Riva's family, meanwhile, found themselves thrust into an unwanted spotlight. Her parents, Barry and June Steenkamp, struggled to process their grief while being constantly pursued by journalists seeking statements, reactions, and insights into their daughter's relationship with Oscar. They had lost their beloved daughter in the most traumatic circumstances imaginable, and now they had to endure having that loss dissected and analyzed by the entire world. The media attention also brought unwanted scrutiny to Oscar's past behavior and relationships. Stories emerged about previous incidents involving firearms, allegations of domestic disputes, and accounts from former girlfriends that painted a picture of someone whose public persona might have masked more troubling private realities. When Oscar's trial finally began on March 3, 2014, it attracted a level of international attention usually reserved for major political events or natural disasters. The North Gauteng High Court in Pretoria became the focal point for a global audience that included not just sports fans and legal experts, but millions of ordinary people who had been captivated by the dramatic fall of a man they had once considered a hero. Judge Thokozile Masipa, an experienced jurist known for her careful deliberation and expertise in cases involving violence against women, presided over proceedings that would last for months and generate thousands of pages of testimony. The prosecution, led by advocate Jerry Nell, painted a picture of a controlling, volatile man who had killed his girlfriend in a fit of rage. The defense, headed by advocate Barry Rue, maintained Oscar's innocence and argued that the shooting was a tragic case of mistaken identity. The evidence presented during the trial was extensive and often contradictory. Neighbors testified about hearing screams and gunshots on the night of the killing, but their accounts varied significantly in terms of timing and sequence. Some claimed to have heard a woman screaming before the shots were fired, which would support the prosecution's theory that Oscar and Riva had been arguing. Others reported hearing only the gunshots followed by screaming, which was more consistent with Oscar's version of events. The ballistics evidence was similarly complex. While it was clear that Oscar had fired the shots that killed Riva, the question of his intent remained hotly debated. The prosecution argued that the pattern of shots, aimed at someone cowering in a toilet cubicle, demonstrated a clear intent to kill. The defense countered that the shots were fired in panic by a man who believed he was defending himself and his girlfriend from violent intruders. Perhaps the most dramatic moment of the trial came when Oscar himself took the stand. For days, the world watched as the man who had once been capable of inspiring millions broke down repeatedly while recounting the events of that terrible night. His testimony was emotional, detailed, and at times almost unbearable to watch. "I heard a noise," he sobbed, describing the moment he claimed to have been awakened by suspicious sounds. "I was scared. I didn't have my legs on. I felt vulnerable." His description of the moments leading up to the shooting painted a picture of mounting terror as he became convinced that intruders were in his home. But it was his account of discovering Riva's body that proved most harrowing. "I couldn't understand why Riva wasn't talking to me," he wept, his voice barely audible above his sobs. "I kept on trying to help her breathe, but the blood kept on coming out of her mouth." The prosecution's cross-examination of Oscar was relentless. Advocate Nell challenged every aspect of his testimony, pointing out inconsistencies and questioning the plausibility of his claims. Why hadn't he checked to see if Riva was still in bed before investigating the supposed intruder? Why hadn't he called out to warn her before opening fire? How could an experienced gun owner claim to have fired 4 shots without thinking about what might be behind the door? On September 11, 2014, after months of testimony and weeks of deliberation, Judge Masipa delivered her verdict. In a decision that shocked many legal experts and disappointed the prosecution, she found Oscar not guilty of murder but guilty of culpable homicide, essentially the South African equivalent of manslaughter. Judge Masipa's reasoning was careful and methodical. While she found that Oscar had acted negligently in firing through the door without properly identifying his target, she concluded that the prosecution had failed to prove beyond reasonable doubt that he had intended to kill Riva or that he knew she was behind the door when he fired. A reasonable person in the position of the accused, Judge Masipa explained, would have foreseen the possibility that whoever was behind the toilet door might be killed by his actions, and would have taken steps to guard against such a possibility. The sentence that followed was controversial in its apparent leniency. Oscar was sentenced to 5 years in prison, with the possibility of being released to house arrest after serving just 10 months. To many observers, particularly those who believed Oscar was guilty of deliberate murder, the sentence seemed inadequate given the gravity of the crime and the loss of life involved. The prosecution, dissatisfied with what they viewed as an overly lenient verdict, immediately announced their intention to appeal. In South African law, the prosecution has the right to appeal not just sentences but also verdicts if they believe legal errors were made during the trial. The appeal process would prove to be another dramatic chapter in the Oscar Pistorius saga. The Supreme Court of Appeal, South Africa's highest court for non-constitutional matters, reviewed Judge Masipa's decision with a focus on her interpretation of the legal principles involved in determining intent and premeditation. On December 3, 2015, the Supreme Court delivered a judgment that would change everything. In a unanimous decision, the 5-judge panel overturned Oscar's culpable homicide conviction and found him guilty of murder. The court's reasoning was devastating to Oscar's defense. Justice Eric Leach, writing for the majority, explained that Judge Masipa had made a fundamental error in her understanding of the legal concept of dolus eventualis, the principle that someone can be guilty of murder if they foresee the possibility that their actions might kill someone and proceed anyway. The identity of his victim is irrelevant to his guilt, Justice Leach wrote in words that would echo through legal circles for years to come. The court found that when Oscar fired 4 bullets through a door, knowing that someone was behind it, he was legally guilty of murder regardless of whether he knew the person was Riva. The new murder conviction carried a minimum sentence of 15 years under South African law, though the court sent the case back to Judge Masipa for resentencing, giving her some discretion to consider mitigating factors. Oscar's time in prison was marked by continuing controversy and legal maneuvering. He served his initial sentence at the Kosi Mampra II management area, formerly Pretoria Central Prison, where he was housed in the hospital wing due to his disability and concerns about his safety among the general prison population. Life behind bars was a dramatic departure from the luxury and adoration that had characterized Oscar's pre-trial existence. The man who had once been cheered by stadiums full of fans now found himself confined to a small cell, his daily routine dictated by prison regulations rather than training schedules and endorsement commitments. Reports from fellow inmates and prison officials painted a picture of a man struggling to come to terms with his fall from grace. Oscar reportedly spent much of his time reading, exercising as much as his confinement allowed, and meeting with counselors in an attempt to understand and process what had led to Riva's death. In July 2016, after serving just over a year of his 5-year sentence, Oscar was released to house arrest at his uncle Arnold's home in Pretoria. The decision sparked immediate controversy, with many critics arguing that such early release sent the wrong message about the seriousness of his crime and the value of Riva's life. But this freedom was short-lived. When Judge Masipa resentenced Oscar following the Supreme Court's murder conviction, she imposed a sentence of 6 years, significantly less than the prescribed minimum of 15 years, but still enough to send him back to prison. Throughout the legal proceedings and media circus, one voice remained constant in its dignity and grace, that of Riva's family. Barry and June Steenkamp, thrust into circumstances no parent should ever have to endure, conducted themselves with a quiet strength that stood in stark contrast to the sensationalism surrounding the case. June Steenkamp, in particular, became a powerful advocate for victims of domestic violence, using her daughter's death as a platform to raise awareness about the epidemic of violence against women in South Africa. Her book, Riva, A Mother's Story, provided insights into both her daughter's life and the family's struggle to find meaning in their devastating loss. The Steenkamp's relationship with Oscar was complex and evolved throughout the legal process. Initially, they seemed willing to accept his version of events, perhaps finding it easier to believe in a tragic accident rather than deliberate murder. However, as more details emerged during the trial and their understanding of the relationship between Oscar and Riva deepened, their position hardened. In victim impact statements and media interviews, the Steenkamp spoke powerfully about the daughter they had lost. They described a young woman who was passionate about life, ambitious about her career, and committed to using her platform to make a positive difference in the world. Riva had been planning to give a speech about domestic violence on the very day she was killed, a bitter irony that was not lost on those who followed the case. Barry Steenkamp's health deteriorated significantly during the years of legal proceedings, and he suffered a stroke that family members attributed in part to the stress of the ongoing case. The elderly man, who had once been a successful businessman, found himself broken by the loss of his daughter and the relentless media attention that surrounded her death. The Oscar Pistorius case became more than just a criminal trial, it evolved into a cultural phenomenon that sparked conversations about disability, celebrity, domestic violence, and the nature of justice itself. The story forced society to confront uncomfortable questions about how we create and then potentially destroy our heroes. For the disabled community, Oscar's fall from grace was particularly painful. He had been more than just an athlete, he had been a symbol of what was possible when determination met opportunity. His success had opened doors and changed perceptions about disability around the world. When that same man was convicted of murder, it felt like a betrayal not just of Riva but of everyone who had found inspiration in his story. The case also highlighted the epidemic of violence against women that plagues South Africa and many other countries around the world. Riva's death became a symbol of the countless women who die at the hands of intimate partners, often after showing the same signs of fear and concern that Riva had expressed to friends about Oscar's behavior. Women's rights advocates used the case to draw attention to the warning signs of abusive relationships, the jealousy, the controlling behavior, the escalating tensions that Riva had reportedly experienced in the weeks leading up to her death. They argued that Riva's story was tragic not just because of how it ended, but because it followed patterns that were all too familiar to those who worked with domestic violence victims. Despite the extensive legal proceedings and media coverage, significant questions about the events of February 14, 2013, remain unanswered. The truth of what happened in Oscar's house that night may never be fully known, leaving room for doubt and speculation that continues to this day. One of the most puzzling aspects of the case was the couple's behavior in the hours leading up to the shooting. Text messages and other evidence suggested that Oscar and Riva had been having relationship difficulties, but there was no clear indication of an argument or confrontation on that specific evening. This absence of an obvious trigger for violence was both a strength and a weakness in the prosecution's case. The forensic evidence, while extensive, was not conclusive enough to definitively prove whether the shooting was intentional or accidental. The trajectory of the bullets, the positions of the bodies, and the acoustic evidence from neighbors all provided pieces of the puzzle, but those pieces could be arranged to support multiple different narratives. Oscar's psychological state at the time of the shooting also remained a subject of debate. Defense experts testified about his heightened anxiety and fear of crime, conditions that they argued could have led to the kind of panic response that resulted in the shooting. Prosecution experts countered that Oscar's behavior was more consistent with deliberate action than panic-driven reaction. The question of whether Oscar was wearing his prosthetic legs when he fired the shots became another point of contention. The defense argued that his vulnerability without his legs explained both his fear and his decision to arm himself. The prosecution suggested that evidence indicated he might have been wearing his prosthetics, which would contradict his version of events and suggest greater premeditation. In November 2017, Oscar was granted parole after serving more than 4 years in prison. His release was met with mixed reactions from a South African public that remained divided about his guilt or innocence. Some viewed him as a man who had been punished appropriately for a tragic mistake, others saw his freedom as an injustice to Riva's memory and a failure of the legal system. Oscar's post-prison life has been markedly different from his previous existence as a global celebrity. He has maintained a low profile, avoiding the media spotlight that once seemed to follow him everywhere. The endorsement deals, speaking engagements, and athletic competitions that had defined his pre-trial existence were no longer available to a convicted murderer. The Steenkamp family has continued their advocacy work, using Riva's memory to campaign for women's rights and against domestic violence. June Steenkamp has become a powerful voice for victims' families, speaking about the long-term impact of violent crime and the inadequacy of a justice system that sometimes seems more concerned with the rights of perpetrators than the suffering of victims. In 2019, as part of South Africa's restorative justice process, Oscar participated in a victim-offender dialogue with Barry Steenkamp. The meeting, which took place under the supervision of correctional services officials, was described as emotional and difficult for both men. Barry Steenkamp later said that while the meeting provided some closure, it could never bring back his daughter or fully heal the wounds that her death had created. Today, more than a decade after that terrible Valentine's Day, the Oscar Pistorius case continues to resonate through South African society and beyond. It remains a story without a truly satisfactory ending, a tragedy that raises more questions than it answers about human nature, celebrity culture, and the complex relationships between men and women. For Oscar Pistorius, the boy who overcame impossible physical odds to become a global icon, the story represents the ultimate cautionary tale about how quickly triumph can turn to tragedy. His athletic achievements, while still remarkable, are now forever overshadowed by the events of February 14, 2013. The man who once inspired millions to believe that anything was possible became instead a reminder that even our greatest heroes are capable of falling to earth in the most devastating ways. For Riva Steenkamp, whose life was cut short at just 29 years old, the case represents both tragedy and legacy. While her death was senseless and preventable, her story has become a powerful tool in the fight against domestic violence. Her image, young, beautiful, and full of unfulfilled potential, serves as a constant reminder of what is lost when relationships turn violent. The Steenkamp family's dignity throughout the ordeal has provided an example of how grace can persist even in the face of unimaginable loss. Their advocacy work has ensured that Riva's death, while tragic, has not been meaningless. Through their efforts, her story continues to educate people about the warning signs of abusive relationships and the importance of taking threats of violence seriously. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Oscar Pistorius case is the questions it raises about the nature of truth and justice. In an age where social media and 24-hour news cycles create pressure for immediate answers and simple narratives, the case serves as a reminder that reality is often more complex than we want to believe. Did Oscar Pistorius deliberately murder Riva Steenkamp in a fit of rage, as the prosecution argued? Or was he a man genuinely terrified of crime who made a tragic mistake in the darkness of his bathroom? The South African legal system has rendered its verdict, but the court of public opinion remains divided. What cannot be disputed is that on February 14, 2013, a young woman with her whole life ahead of her died violently in circumstances that could have been prevented. Whether through better communication, anger management, gun control, or simply the basic human decency to resolve conflicts without violence, Riva Steenkamp's death represents a failure that extends far beyond any individual. As visitors to Riva's grave in Port Elizabeth will attest, her headstone bears a simple inscription, "Beloved daughter and sister." It is a reminder that behind all the legal arguments, media speculation, and public fascination lies a fundamental human truth, that every life has value, every death diminishes us all, and every act of violence creates ripples of pain that extend far beyond its immediate victims. The silence that now surrounds Oscar Pistorius is very different from the cheers that once greeted his athletic triumphs. It is the silence of a man who must live with the knowledge that his actions, whatever their intent, ended the life of someone he claimed to love. And in that silence, perhaps, lies the only justice that this tragic story will ever know. The tracks where Oscar once ran so magnificently, the podiums where he stood triumphant, the stadiums where crowds chanted his name, they all seem like memories from another lifetime now. The Blade Runner who once defied every limitation placed upon him discovered, in the end, that there are some barriers that cannot be overcome, some falls from which there is no recovery. And somewhere in the South African sunshine, in a cemetery overlooking the ocean where she loved to walk, Riva Steenkamp rests in the peace that was so violently taken from her on that Valentine's Day night. Her story, tragic as it is, continues to speak to new generations about the preciousness of life and the devastating consequences when love turns to violence. The case of Oscar Pistorius and Riva Steenkamp will be remembered not just as a criminal trial, but as a mirror held up to society itself, reflecting our capacity for both extraordinary achievement and devastating failure, our hunger for heroes and our fascination with their destruction. In the years following the trial, psychologists and criminologists have continued to analyze the case, attempting to understand the psychological factors that may have contributed to the tragedy. Oscar's personality, as revealed through testimony and expert analysis, presented a complex picture of a man shaped by both extraordinary triumph and profound vulnerability. Dr. Merrill Forster, a psychiatrist who examined Oscar during the trial, described him as suffering from generalized anxiety disorder, a condition that could have been exacerbated by his disability and his hypervigilance about personal security. The constant awareness of his physical vulnerability, combined with South Africa's high crime rate, had apparently created a state of chronic anxiety that manifested in various ways throughout his life. This psychological profile helped explain some of Oscar's behavior patterns that emerged during the trial. His collection of firearms, his obsession with home security, and his tendency to react aggressively to perceived threats all fit the pattern of someone living with chronic anxiety about his personal safety. However, critics argued that these psychological factors, while potentially relevant to understanding Oscar's mindset, did not excuse or fully explain the events of February 14, 2013. Many people live with anxiety disorders without resorting to violence, and Oscar's wealth and fame had provided him with security resources far beyond what most South Africans could afford. The relationship between Oscar's disability and his psychological state also became a subject of intense debate. Some experts suggested that his extraordinary success as an athlete might have masked deeper insecurities about his physical limitations, creating internal tensions that could explode under stress. Others pointed to the way society had treated Oscar, simultaneously celebrating his achievements while constantly emphasizing his disability, as potentially problematic. The pressure of being a symbol and inspiration for millions of people might have created psychological burdens that were invisible to the public but overwhelming for the individual carrying them. The Oscar Pistorius case sent shockwaves through the Paralympic movement and the broader world of disability sport. For years, Oscar had been the most visible face of Paralympic competition, and his success had helped elevate the profile and respect accorded to disabled athletes around the world. His fall from grace created a crisis of representation for the Paralympic movement. The organization found itself in the difficult position of having to distance itself from its former poster boy while trying to protect the broader mission of promoting disability sport and changing perceptions about what disabled people could achieve. The case also raised complex questions about the relationship between disability and behavior. Some critics worried that the emphasis on Oscar's psychological state and anxiety disorder perpetuated harmful stereotypes about disabled people being emotionally unstable or prone to violence. Disability rights advocates worked hard to ensure that Oscar's actions were not seen as representative of the disabled community as a whole. The International Paralympic Committee eventually stripped Oscar of all his honors and banned him from future competition, a decision that was both necessary and heartbreaking for an organization that had once been so proud to claim him as their own. Young disabled athletes who had looked up to Oscar as a role model found themselves grappling with complex emotions about their former hero. Many had to reconstruct their understanding of what success meant and find new sources of inspiration for their own athletic journeys. From a legal perspective, the Oscar Pistorius case has become a landmark in South African jurisprudence, particularly regarding the concepts of intent and the application of dolus eventualis in murder cases. Law schools now study the case as an example of how complex legal principles play out in real-world scenarios. The Supreme Court's decision to overturn Judge Masipa's original verdict established important precedents about how courts should interpret the concept of foreseeable consequences in violent crimes. The ruling clarified that the identity of the victim is irrelevant when determining whether someone intended to kill. What matters is whether the accused foresaw that their actions could result in death and proceeded anyway. This legal principle has implications that extend far beyond the Pistorius case. It affects how South African courts handle other cases involving shootings through doors, walls, or other barriers where the shooter claims not to have known who they were targeting. The case also highlighted issues with South Africa's bail system and sentencing guidelines. Oscar's initial release on bail despite being charged with murder sparked debates about whether wealthy, high-profile defendants receive preferential treatment in the justice system. The disparity between Judge Masipa's original 6-year sentence and a 15-year minimum prescribed by law also raised questions about judicial discretion and the consistency of sentencing in serious crimes. Legal experts continue to debate whether Masipa's consideration of mitigating factors was appropriate or whether it undermined the deterrent effect that minimum sentences are meant to provide. The intense media coverage of the Oscar Pistorius trial raised important questions about the ethics of reporting on high-profile criminal cases and the potential impact of publicity on the administration of justice. The case became a textbook example of how media attention could both illuminate and distort the truth. On one hand, the extensive coverage ensured that the case received the scrutiny it deserved and that the public was fully informed about the proceedings. The live television broadcasts of the trial allowed viewers to form their own opinions based on the actual evidence presented in court rather than relying solely on second-hand reports. However, the media circus also created problems. The constant presence of cameras and reporters turned the courthouse into a theater where participants might have been tempted to play to the audience rather than focus solely on the search for truth. Witnesses could have been influenced by the knowledge that their testimony was being broadcast to millions of viewers. The 24-hour news cycle's demand for constant updates and analysis also led to speculation and commentary that sometimes went beyond what the evidence could support. Legal experts, journalists, and commentators felt pressure to provide definitive opinions about Oscar's guilt or innocence even when the evidence was ambiguous or incomplete. Social media added another layer of complexity to the case, creating echo chambers where people could reinforce their existing beliefs about Oscar's guilt or innocence without being exposed to contrary evidence or viewpoints. The polarization that resulted sometimes seemed to have more to do with people's pre-existing attitudes about celebrity, disability, or domestic violence than with the specific facts of the case. As of 2025, Oscar Pistorius remains a figure largely withdrawn from public life. Having served his sentence and been released on parole, he faces the challenge of rebuilding an existence that can never return to what it once was. The man who once traveled the world as a celebrated athlete now lives quietly, his movements restricted by parole conditions and his opportunities limited by his criminal conviction. Reports suggest that Oscar has struggled with depression and has required ongoing psychological support to cope with the consequences of his actions. The contrast between his current existence and his former life as a global celebrity serves as a powerful reminder of how quickly circumstances can change and how individual choices can have irreversible consequences. The sporting world has largely moved on, with new Paralympic stars emerging to inspire the next generation of disabled athletes. The records Oscar once held have been broken, and the barriers he broke down have allowed others to achieve even greater success. In this sense, perhaps his most positive legacy remains intact, the proof that physical limitations need not define human potential. Riva's family continues their advocacy work, ensuring that her memory lives on through efforts to combat domestic violence and support victims' families. The Riva Rebecca Steenkamp Foundation works to educate young people about healthy relationships and to provide resources for those experiencing domestic abuse. The story of Oscar Pistorius and Riva Steenkamp defies simple categorization. It is neither a clear-cut case of domestic violence nor an obvious tragic accident. Instead, it exists in the gray areas that make the human experience so complex and difficult to understand. What we know for certain is that a young woman with everything to live for died violently in circumstances that could have been prevented. Whether through better communication, professional help for relationship problems, responsible gun ownership, or simply walking away from a troubled relationship, Riva Steenkamp's death represents a failure of the systems, personal, social, and institutional, that should protect people from violence. We also know that a man who had overcome incredible odds to achieve greatness threw it all away in a few seconds of devastating decision-making. Whether motivated by rage, fear, or some combination of factors we may never fully understand, Oscar Pistorius transformed himself from inspiration to cautionary tale with the pull of a trigger. The case serves as a reminder that heroism and villainy are not fixed categories but states of being that can shift with frightening speed. The same qualities that make someone capable of extraordinary achievement, determination, intensity, competitive drive, can potentially become destructive when channeled in the wrong directions or combined with other problematic factors. Perhaps most importantly, the story forces us to confront the reality that domestic violence can occur in any relationship, regardless of wealth, fame, or social status. The warning signs that Riva's friends observed, the jealousy, the controlling behavior, the escalating tensions, are tragically familiar to anyone who has worked with domestic violence victims. As time passes and the immediate drama of the case fades from memory, what remains is the human cost of the tragedy. Two families were forever changed on that Valentine's Day night. One lost a daughter and sister, the other saw their son and brother's life destroyed by his own actions. The empty chair at family gatherings, the photographs that capture moments of happiness that will never come again, the dreams and aspirations that died with Riva, these are the true measures of what was lost. No legal verdict, no amount of media coverage, and no passage of time can restore what was taken away in those few seconds of violence. In the end, the case of Oscar Pistorius and Riva Steenkamp stands as a testament to the fragility of human happiness and the irreversible nature of certain choices. It reminds us that beneath the surface of even the most successful and celebrated lives, there can lurk the potential for tragedy. The Blade Runner who once soared over barriers and limitations discovered that there are some obstacles that cannot be overcome, some races that cannot be won, and some mistakes that can never be undone. And in learning this truth, he joined the ranks of those whose stories serve as warnings to future generations about the price of violence and the preciousness of the lives we hold in our hands. The courtroom is empty now, the cameras have moved on to other stories, and the headlines have faded into history. But somewhere in the quiet moments of reflection that come to all of us, the questions raised by this case continue to echo. How well do we really know the people we love? What warning signs do we ignore at our peril? And when does a hero become a villain in the complex moral landscape of human behavior? These questions have no easy answers, which perhaps is the most fitting legacy of all for a case that has refused to provide the simple resolution that our hunger for justice demands. In the end, the story of Oscar and Riva is not just their story, it is a reflection of all our stories, with all their potential for both transcendent triumph and devastating tragedy.